Did Hollywood studios once consider burying their own productions to sidestep public outrage? Through the 1940s, while American soldiers fought battles overseas, an equally intense struggle was unfolding behind closed doors at home, pitting fearless storytellers against a powerful moral gatekeeping system hell-bent on controlling what reached the screen. These were not small disagreements. Studio bosses were ordering reels destroyed, cinema owners were bolting their doors shut, and elected officials on the Senate floor were labeling performers a corrupting force on the nation's values. 15 productions. 15 accounts of boldness, rebellion, and the kind of uncompromising filmmaking that permanently reshaped the art form. Number 15. This Gun for Hire. 1942. Paramount Pictures found itself in a difficult position. They had just handed the lead role to a largely unknown performer named Alan Ladd, not as a tortured anti-hero, not as someone searching for salvation, but as a professional killer, and somehow expected viewers to be on his side. Everything about this contradicted what the production code required of storytellers at the time. Raven, the character Ladd portrayed, takes a woman's life in the film's earliest moments without the slightest flicker of guilt. He moves through the world with cold precision and a strange pull that audiences couldn't resist. The regulatory framework of the era insisted that wrongdoers be condemned and made to suffer. It had never accounted for the possibility that viewers might cheer for one. Working behind closed doors, Paramount's compliance team spent weeks submitting revised drafts that met the letter of the code while director Frank Tuttle steadily filmed exactly what he had always planned. The studio's own distribution division threatened to pull the release from certain regions altogether. Ladd himself later disclosed that key scenes were captured twice, one version designed to satisfy regulators, another intended for the final cut. When the film opened anyway, crowds showed up in force. It pulled in well above $3 million and transformed Ladd into an overnight sensation, demonstrating that complicated, morally gray characters weren't just acceptable to audiences, they were exactly what audiences wanted. Number 14. Cat People. 1942. Working at RKO, producer Val Luton constructed this unsettling psychological thriller on a budget of barely $140,000, and managed to leave audiences deeply disturbed without placing a single creature on screen. The premise, a woman haunted by the belief that arousal could transform her into a lethal panther, was, under any straightforward interpretation, entirely at odds with what the production code permitted. Desire as something dangerous, female psychology as a source of menace, sexuality woven into the fabric of horror, all of it occupied strictly prohibited ground. Luton's approach was built on restraint and implication. Everything threatening existed just beyond the frame, communicated through darkness and sound rather than anything visible. Censorship officials found themselves unable to point to any specific moment that broke the rules, because nothing explicit had been recorded. Yet every adult watching understood exactly what the film was conveying. Cinema operators across several southern states, partnered with RKO, declined to run it on grounds of local decency. Religious organizations lodged formal complaints with the Production Code Administration and pushed for scenes to be removed after the fact. Their demands went unmet. The film ultimately brought in over $4 million on its minimal investment, and those who study cinema history later pointed to it as the turning point when Hollywood grasped that restraint and suggestion could generate more dread and more revenue than anything shown outright. Number 13. Double Indemnity. 1944. When Billy Wilder and Raymond Chandler set out to adapt James Cain's story of an insurance salesman drawn into helping a wife eliminate her husband, they were working with material that every other studio in town had spent the better part of a decade refusing to touch. The narrative centered on infidelity, carefully planned killing, and the element that caused the deepest alarm, a woman who was the architect and driving force behind everything. Barbara Stanwyck's character Phyllis was not someone undone by circumstance or weakness. She was purposeful, cold-blooded, and offered no apologies for either. The production code required that figures like her face clear moral consequences, and the film technically provided that outcome. But regulators were far more troubled by how compellingly watchable the film made her in the meantime. Paramount's own executive board voted to block the production entirely. The head of the studio reportedly refused outright to let Wilder proceed, forcing him to climb the chain of command to secure approval from another senior figure altogether. When the Legion of Decency assigned it a B rating and helped coordinate theater walkouts across 3 metropolitan areas, critics remained split while paying audiences showed no hesitation. The film ranked among the year's strongest performers commercially, and has since been recognized as the standard-bearer for the entire film noir tradition. Number 12. Mildred Pierce. 1945. Jack Warner inserted himself into the production of this film on multiple occasions, persuaded that what was being built on his lot would bring serious damage to the studio's reputation. The narrative followed a woman who constructs a thriving restaurant business entirely through her own determination, surrendering nearly everything in the process to a daughter who never appreciates the sacrifice. For the executives overseeing the project, the themes were deeply unsettling. A woman's ambition treated as legitimate, class boundaries crossed without punishment, the institution of the family portrayed in a state of quiet collapse, and a mother-daughter bond so psychologically fraught it defied easy categorization under any existing code provision. Director Michael Curtiz fought to preserve the film's harder edges throughout production. Scenes were re-recorded at the studio's insistence, and then carefully reintroduced into the final assembly. The censorship body pushed for structural changes to the way the film's central act of violence was presented, arguing the original framing made it appealing rather than cautionary. Religious coalitions sent formal objections to Warner Brothers theater locations across 4 different states before the film had even screened publicly. Joan Crawford received the Academy Award for Best Actress for her performance. The film brought in close to $6 million at the box office. Jack Warner's interventions came to an end. Number 11. The Lost Weekend. 1945. Paramount completed this portrait of a writer's complete unraveling through alcohol dependence, held a screening for studio leadership, and then spent serious time weighing whether it should ever be released at all. Representatives from the liquor industry are said to have approached Paramount with an offer of $5 million in exchange for destroying the original negative. Their argument, delivered directly to studio executives, was that the film's unsparing depiction of addiction would cause lasting harm to their commercial interests. Theater partners at Paramount in multiple regional markets declined to make advance commitments. What the film actually showed was a man at the furthest possible remove from dignity, experiencing delusions, taking money from relatives, trading a writing machine for a bottle, and it did so without constructing the path back to respectability that the production code had come to expect. Wilder had submitted a draft that gestured more explicitly toward rehabilitation. What ended up on screen was far more open-ended and troubling. The Legion of Decency moved toward formal condemnation. Then the critical reception arrived. Reviewers described it as a landmark achievement. It collected 4 Academy Awards, among them the prize for Best Picture. Every organized opposition collapsed. Number 10. Gilda. 1946. Columbia Pictures was aware they were sitting on something difficult before the cameras had even stopped rolling. Rita Hayworth's portrayal of Gilda, a woman who understands exactly the effect she has on others and deploys it with complete intentionality, was something censorship officials had no prior framework for handling. The scene that became the film's defining moment, in which Hayworth performs what amounts to a staged undressing while removing only one long glove, generated more scrutiny than almost any comparable sequence in the decade precisely because its meaning was unmistakable while its content remained technically clean. Studio documentation indicates that production code reviewers returned to the sequence 17 separate times in their assessment sessions, unable to formally identify a violation while being entirely certain one existed in spirit. Cinema chains across 8 states put together organized refusals to run the picture unless alterations were made. The Legion of Decency produced a B rating accompanied by a written statement of unusual length, focusing not on any particular moment but on the film's overall perspective on morality. Columbia's marketing team responded by reprinting the condemnation in paid advertisements. The film cleared $3.5 million in its opening weeks alone. Number 9. The Best Years of Our Lives. 1946. Samuel Goldwyn's account of servicemen making their way back to ordinary life after the war generated a form of resistance unlike anything the others on this list encountered. The opposition came not from religious institutions but from military leadership and powerful political voices who declared the film an affront to national pride. Rather than depicting return as triumph, the film showed veterans navigating joblessness, dependence on alcohol, crumbling marriages, and the kind of psychological damage that official discourse preferred not to acknowledge. One of its central figures was a man who had lost both hands in service, and was portrayed by Harold Russell, a veteran who had genuinely suffered that injury. Distribution executives at multiple companies told Goldwyn the film was too dispiriting for general audiences and pressed him to allow significant recutting. Organizations representing veterans were formally consulted, and a number of them registered public disapproval. Goldwyn made no changes. Running to nearly 3 hours in length, a duration that theater chain managers across the country treated as commercially irresponsible, the film collected 7 Academy Awards and finished the decade as Hollywood's single highest-earning release. Number 8. Crossfire. 1947. RKO came close to abandoning this project entirely on 2 separate occasions before it reached completion. The film was a crime story in which a Jewish man is murdered by a soldier motivated by anti-Semitic hatred, and the studio's leadership understood from the beginning that making that hatred the explicit center of the narrative, not background texture, not implication, but the entire driving force of the plot, was something the marketplace might not tolerate. Across the major theater circuits, preemptive refusals to commit to distribution arrived on the grounds that Southern and Midwestern audiences would reject the subject matter. The American Legion filed a formal protest against the characterization of a returning veteran as the story's primary antagonist. Several distribution partners lobbied to have the film's core conflict broadened into something more general, eliminating the specifically Jewish dimension entirely. Director Edward Dmytryk declined. Producer Adrian Scott declined. Both men were subsequently identified as members of the Hollywood 10 and stripped of their ability to work in the industry. The film received 5 nominations from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, generated close to $2 million in net earnings, and stands today as the first film produced by a major American studio to make anti-Semitism its explicit and undisguised subject. Number 7. Gentleman's Agreement. 1947. Darryl F. Zanuck at 20th Century Fox encountered a form of opposition he had not anticipated. The resistance to making a film about anti-Semitism arrived from within prominent circles of the Jewish community itself. A number of high-ranking Jewish executives and public figures made private representations to the effect that a mainstream theatrical release on the subject would draw attention that would worsen rather than improve the situation. Zanuck, who had no personal stake in the matter from a religious standpoint, moved forward regardless. Gregory Peck played a journalist who takes on a Jewish identity for an extended investigative assignment and finds himself encountering discrimination in employment, housing, and ordinary social exchange. Several of Fox's major theater chain partners in northeastern markets withheld early distribution agreements. A broad coalition of religious bodies formally reviewed the screenplay and submitted requests that scenes showing ordinary social anti-Semitism be made less specific, on the grounds that depicting it too clearly might plant suggestions in susceptible minds. Zanuck rejected every proposed modification. The film received 3 Academy Awards, including the prize for Best Picture. Its director, Elia Kazan, would go on to become among the most polarizing individuals in the history of the American film industry, though for entirely separate reasons. Number 6. Force of Evil. 1948. The film that director Abraham Polanski made about a lawyer who consciously places his skills in service of organized crime while constructing elaborate justifications for doing so was politically combustible enough that Polanski was, without knowing it, closing out his career in American cinema with its production. The production code's objections to the screenplay were rooted in its underlying argument. The film did not treat institutional corruption as an aberration from an otherwise functioning system but presented it as the system's normal operating condition, with legitimate capitalism and criminal enterprise running on identical logic. The code's position was that criminal behavior belonged to individuals who departed from social norms. Polanski's film insisted those norms and that behavior were the same thing. MGM's distribution operation refused to take the film on. It was placed with an independent outlet and shown in a limited number of locations. Multiple newspaper groups declined to carry its advertising. Polanski was added to the industry blacklist the following year and spent the next 2 decades unable to direct in America. Force of Evil is now part of the standard curriculum at film schools, studying the outer limits of what commercial American cinema was capable of expressing. Number 5. Pinky. 1949, 20th Century Fox released a film about a black woman whose complexion allows her to move through white society undetected, and who returns to a deeply segregated region of the American South. And the controversy that followed required Fox executives to make direct personal appeals to cinema operators in no fewer than 12 states. The lead performance went to Jean Crane, a white actress, a casting decision that itself drew sharp criticism from black publications and community voices. The organized refusal of theater operators throughout the South to screen the film, however, was driven by something more fundamental. The film made no attempt to soften or qualify its condemnation of racial segregation at a historical moment when taking that position openly was treated as commercially reckless and politically dangerous. Fox representatives working Southern distribution routes encountered direct personal threats. Operators who agreed to show the film came under formal pressure from local government officials. The municipality of Marshall, Texas, issued a legal ban on the film's exhibition. That ban eventually reached the United States Supreme Court, which overturned it in 1952. The film generated over $4 million in revenue despite the coordinated resistance mounted against it, and remains a significant, if complicated, chapter in Hollywood's long and uneven engagement with American racial politics. Number 4. All the King's Men. 1949. Columbia Pictures found itself in possession of a film that would go on to win the Academy Award for Best Picture, and that a substantial number of major theater chains refused to exhibit because they were convinced it constituted a political assault on people currently holding public office. Drawn from Robert Penn Warren's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, the film followed the ascent and destruction of a Southern political figure whose resemblance to the late Louisiana Governor Huey Long was impossible to miss. The organized political network that Long had built during his lifetime mobilized actively against the film, applying direct pressure to cinema owners in Louisiana and the surrounding region. Multiple chains operating in southern markets pulled the picture after a single week in response to that organized pressure. Columbia's own distribution leadership debated internally whether releasing it at all was advisable given the political environment. Broderick Crawford won the Academy Award for Best Actor. The film took home Best Picture. The effort to suppress it through coordinated operator pressure and studio-level resistance eventually gave way under the weight of the award's recognition, but the nature of that suppression campaign, organized by a political machine rather than a religious body, represented something the film industry had not previously confronted. Number 3. Home of the Brave. 1949. Stanley Kramer produced this account of a black soldier returning from combat in the Second World War carrying serious psychological damage, built it for under $500,000, and then found every major studio unwilling to handle its distribution. United Artists agreed to take it on only after negotiations that extended over a considerable period. Theater circuits operating throughout the South refused to carry it at all. Several operators in northern cities came under organized pressure from groups characterizing the film as an instrument of communist influence, their reasoning being that any work suggesting American racism caused measurable harm to individual human beings must have a subversive political agenda. The psychiatrist character at the film center, a figure whose entire function is to treat the soldier's trauma by naming and examining the racism behind it, was judged so politically unacceptable by at least one major circuit that the chain made rewriting or removing him a condition of any distribution conversation. Kramer declined every such condition. The film brought in over $2 million through independent distribution channels and established Kramer as the defining voice of the socially conscious American film for the decade to come. Number 2. Champion. 1949. Kirk Douglas took the central role in this film about a boxer who dismantles the people around him as systematically as he defeats opponents in the ring, and the production that backed him faced organized boycott pressure rooted in something neither moral guardians nor political operators had previously targeted: the film's fundamental argument about what ambition does to a person. The production code contained no explicit provision against portraying success as a corrupting force, but the administrators overseeing it were made deeply uncomfortable by a narrative that presented achievement as the mechanism of personal destruction with no counterbalancing moral framework offering any alternative reading. The protagonist reaches the summit. Then he is gone. The film extends no consolation and draws no lesson. Multiple major exhibition circuits withheld distribution commitments and pushed for an alternate ending to be produced. Director Mark Robson refused every such request. The film collected 6 Academy Award nominations and established Douglas as a figure of genuine cinematic weight. It also marked the point at which critics began articulating something that had been building throughout the decade. A distinctly American narrative form in which the rise and fall story was not tragedy imposed from outside but destruction authored from within. Number 1. Sunset Boulevard, 1950. When Paramount Pictures completed Billy Wilder's excavation of the mythology Hollywood had constructed around itself, the studio understood immediately that it had produced something the industry might find genuinely difficult to forgive. The film's narrator is already dead when the story begins, face down in the water of a private swimming pool. Everything that follows is a systematic dismantling of every illusion American cinema had cultivated about fame, stardom, and the relationship between the screen and the people it consumed. Louis B. Mayer, after sitting through an early preview, reportedly sought out producer Charles Brackett in the building's lobby and told him directly that what he had made was a betrayal serious enough to warrant expulsion from the industry entirely. The theater chains affiliated with MGM initially withheld distribution partnerships. Leadership at 3 separate competing studios reached out to Paramount executives to register formal objections to what had been produced. The depiction of Norma Desmond, an older actress existing in a condition of magnificent, terrifying self-delusion, was read across the industry as a deliberate act of contempt toward every woman of a certain age still working in Hollywood. Multiple prominent performers declined their invitations to the premiere. Gloria Swanson, who brought Desmond to life on screen, was quietly excluded from the awards conversation by an industry that recognized the performance's brilliance while resenting what it implied about them. The film received 11 nominations from the Academy and won 3 of the major categories. It is now regarded by the broad consensus of film criticism as among the greatest works American cinema has ever produced. Every studio that worked to suppress it spent the remainder of the decade failing to make anything that came close. These 15 productions have one essential quality in common. Every person responsible for bringing them into existence operated from the understanding that the most threatening thing a story can accomplish is an honest account of reality. The regulatory systems, the organized walkouts, the refusals to distribute, none of that was evidence that these films exceeded acceptable limits. Every bit of that resistance was confirmation that these films landed with exactly the precision their makers intended.